I have several different types of sanders in my shop, but I definitely use the random orbit sander the most. In this video, I want to point out 5 sanding mistakes that we've all made, and by we've all made, I really mean me. But if my incompetence can prevent just one person from sanding through a plywood's veneer, it will have all been worth ruining some of my projects. Nah, not really. Out of all of the things to screw up in woodworking, sanding errors can be the most infuriating because we mostly sand near the end of a project after we've spent hours being so careful building and assembling. It's kind of like if you lost a wheel on the last mile of the Indy 500. That could happen, right? Hi, I'm Steve. Welcome to Woodworking for Mere Mortals, the channel dedicated to helping beginning woodworkers learn woodworking without a lot of space or expensive tools. If you're brand new to this hobby, I've created a tool buying guide that will show you how to set up shop for under $1,000. Download yours at mytoollist.com. Also, be sure to check out my sanding basics video to learn everything you need to know about sanding. There's links to both of these resources down in the description. In the real world, woodworking joints aren't always as perfect as they are on every Instagram post ever. So let's say you've joined 2 boards together that aren't exactly flush. Hey, it's just a little off, and a couple of minutes of 60 grit sandpaper will smooth it right out. You fire up your sander and attack. Yay, both sides are flush. But now you have a cupped board because you neglected the middle. And if this was the bottom of a box or something, now you've got a rocker. There's nothing wrong with sanding uneven joints. Just make sure you sand equally along the length of the board. Making a pencil mark along the entire board can help. Sand until it disappears evenly. By the way, whenever you want to test if something is flat, use your table saw. Its table is probably the flattest surface in your shop. This is a really common one. A sander is a simple way to ease over the sharp edges of a tabletop. If you're gonna do this, pay close attention to the corners. It's very tempting to maintain the same sanding motion and just hit those corners, right? Well, 2 things can happen. First, you're a bit too enthusiastic and you basically remove the corner. It only takes a power sander a second to just nerf that corner. Sure, it won't poke an eye out, but rounded corners can look kind of weird. Second, when you sand the vertical edge of a corner, you might be left with a big bulge. The main reason this happens is because there's a flex to the sanding disc. When you press the sander against a corner, there's concentrated force on just a small part of the sander and the disc cups. A solution is to use something rigid like sanding sticks and ease over these edges by hand. This is a free paint can stirring stick from the hardware store. I use spray adhesive to stick some sandpaper to it. We sometimes think the only purpose of sanding is to remove gouges, scratches, and other rough spots. And while these are important, try not to think of sanding as a spot procedure. The entire project needs to be sanded in order to achieve a good finish. Treat the sanding phase of a project with as much attention as you give to making accurate cuts. Probably the most neglected parts are wide faces, say the top of a table or the sides of a bookshelf. We might spot sand a few glaring problem areas, then just give the rest a quick once-over. These surfaces might appear nice and smooth, but oftentimes surface imperfections won't appear until you apply a finish. The main purpose of sanding is to prepare all surfaces to accept a finish. So get some headphones and some music and spend some quality time in the sanding zone. And everything I just said about not neglecting the faces, here's the exception, and it's a big exception. Plywood. Most plywood you will use for a woodworking project is pre-sanded. It may need a little sanding, but not much. Feel the surface with your hand. If it feels a little fuzzy, you can knock down those wood fibers with 120 or 220 grit sandpaper. I definitely don't ever sand plywood with anything more coarse than a 120 grit sandpaper. And even then, I just lightly sand. Be careful not to hold the sander in any one spot. The problem is that plywood is made up of multiple layers of cheaper wood and then a thin veneer of good wood on top. If you use hardwood plywood, say cherry or walnut, that veneer is even thinner. And it doesn't take long to sand completely through this paper thin layer and just ruin the surface. And this can be exceptionally devastating because not only is it usually on a very visible surface, but there's really no way to fix it. This might occur when you use solid wood edging to hide the plywood edges and it isn't flush with the top, or maybe an inset top like this one. Since that edging is solid wood, sanding it down is no problem, but as soon as it gets close to flush, your sander will start abrading the plywood, and a second later, you've got a nasty spot in that corner. To avoid this, try sticking some painter's tape to the plywood to protect it while you're sanding, and of course, try your best to align the edge banding flush to begin with. The second problem that can lead to oversanding is trying to remove dried glue. If you get any glue on the plywood, you can sand it off with 120 grit sandpaper, but just be super careful. Whenever I build with plywood, I try to be more diligent about glue and just wipe off any excess right away with a damp cloth. It doesn't take long to figure out that a round disc will not be able to sand inside corners, but what we might forget is how difficult it is for a random orbit sander to sand all the way to the edge of an inside surface. Let's say you're sanding the bottom shelf of a bookcase. That's the non-removable one. You might want to sand right to that back edge or the side edge, so you run the sander along the surface pressed against the perpendicular side. And what you discover is a gouge all along that surface where the edges of the sanding disc rubbed. Usually if you do this a couple of times, you'll learn not to make this mistake. But if you're really prone to doing this, you can run some tape along that edge to protect it. It's probably just fine to avoid sanding that close. I mean, you're gonna have to sand the corners by hand anyway, and it'll just take a little bit longer to hand sand right up to those inside edges. Plus, these inside surfaces are usually secondary and won't be visible. Usually just a light sanding is fine. As with all sanding, pay the greatest attention to your primary surfaces, the ones that people will see.